Dear brothers and sisters, I want you to understand that the gospel message I preach is not based on mere human reasoning. I received my message from no human source, and no one taught me. Instead, I received it by direct revelation from Jesus Christ. You know what I was like when I followed the Jewish religion, how I violently persecuted God's church. I did my best to destroy it. I was far ahead of my fellow Jews in my zeal for the traditions of my ancestors. But even before I was born, God chose me and called me by his marvelous grace. Then it pleased him to reveal his Son to me so that I would proclaim the good news about Jesus to the Gentiles. When this happened, I did not rush out to consult with any human being, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to consult with those who were apostles before I was. Instead, I went away into Arabia, and later I returned to the city of Damascus.
All right, so timeline, what happens? So what happens in the timeline? Because the way Luke records it, right after the conversion, he goes over to Jerusalem. At least that's the way it's written, the way it's conveyed. That's not what happens, right? What happens? Went to Arabia. Now, I have no concept of geography, so all I know is that he went away from Damascus and not to Jerusalem. So that's about the extent of, if I'm not mistaken, it's east, right? Arabia would be east of Jerusalem. I mean, it happens to be, right? I guess you could go up around the water, because Damascus,
would you like to go
is north. But that's one of those things. This is one of those things I should have looked up before I started talking, but that's okay. Those are once a week, so hopefully I don't have that at all this week in class. But the way Luke records it, it makes it seem like he goes straight to Damascus after his conversion all the way back to Jerusalem. And so that would make it seem like initially that you have Paul, who left Jerusalem to go to Damascus to go round up Christians and put them in jail, being converted, and then a couple of weeks later, essentially, going back to Jerusalem. So that's not what happened. He went over to Arabia first, and then he ended up going back to Damascus, and then he went back down to Jerusalem. Now, when Paul got to Jerusalem, what was the response of the Christians? Fear. Terrified. Now, we don't know how long Paul was necessarily in Arabia, right? I think it was mentioned. It was just for some time. Yeah, so he's there for some time. We don't know how long, but he was there not long enough, apparently, for the Christians in Jerusalem to feel safe, right? Now, that's important, as we'll talk about that later, but I just wanted to set the timeline first because it all runs together. Okay, so back to Acts chapter 9, verse 20, and immediately he proclaimed Jesus in the synagogue, saying, "He is the Son of God." And all who heard him were amazed and said, "Is this not the man who made heaven and Jerusalem, and those who called upon this name? And has he not come here for the purpose to bring them bound before the chief priests?" First off, I think the word that stands out to me is the word immediately. So right after Paul is baptized and after he has received food and strengthened, he immediately proclaims Jesus in the synagogue. Now, I think what's interesting is we have kind of the reference later on when they had the plot to kill him. The disciples took him away, so he converted those who were with him, possibly. But his response after learning Jesus, his response after obeying Jesus is to immediately proclaim him. And that's his visceral reaction. His gut response is immediately proclaim him. And he does so how? In the synagogues where the Jews are.
Yeah, he goes right in there.
He goes right in there. Now, why? Why does he go to the synagogue where the Jews are? Don't overthink this one.
Because they're the ones that know God.
Okay?
They have the background and they're the only ones who are being, right?
Yes.
Conversion hasn't, we haven't had Peter with the vision yet, right?
No, that was a shepherd's sermon.
Yeah, never mind. Okay, well,
No. Maybe not. Yeah, chapter 10, you're right. I haven't had that yet. Okay. That's a good point, and that's true. We'll get to that part in a moment. But why would Paul immediately go to the synagogues and proclaim Jesus there? Because that's what Paul knows how to do.
He's a poke the bear kind of guy.
Yes, but what's his training? What's his formal education? He is a Jew among Jews, right? He is the best of the best when it comes to the Jewish faith. And so what's he do? He goes to the people of the Jewish faith to teach Jesus to them. He goes to his people. He goes to those who would have the same level of understanding and knowledge of Scripture that he would. So he does what he knows how to do. I don't think I have my tenses correct on those verbs, but I don't. I'm not going to try one. Okay? But then that's, I think, one of the most important parts is following his conversion, immediately Paul goes and proclaims Jesus in the way that Paul knows how to proclaim Jesus. Okay? And I think that's important to point out because I might feel comfortable going to a synagogue. I mean, I like theology, I like the philosophical part, but not everyone does. So going and proclaiming Jesus, when you learn something of Jesus, will look different for everyone. But the point is to do it immediately. The point is to proclaim what you know and what you have learned about Jesus immediately, the way you know how to. That's kind of my plan. Now, going to what Jill said, he went to the synagogue. Why does he go to the synagogue?
because they're the ones that have the scriptural background and because the Gentiles are not being included yet.
Right. Yeah, Bonnie and Clyde, why do you rob banks? That's where the money is. Oh, it's Bonnie and Clyde? Yeah. Why do you go to synagogues? Well, that's where the believers in God are. But also, to make that point, to put a little bow on Jill's point, I went the wrong way. I went to Acts 1. Romans 1, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and then also the Gentile, or also to the Greek, as easy as it says, Gentiles. So, yeah, I'm going there. And then, as Jill points out, actually in the very next chapter, Peter goes to Cornelius, which is taking the gospel to the Gentiles. Verse 21, and he heard, and all who were amazed, is this not the man who made havoc in Jerusalem? We talked about this a little bit in the summer quarter when we were going over Hebrews. I think it's always a good point worth mentioning. While one's sins are readily forgiven, it does not mean the consequences are removed. And we obviously see this when Paul gets back to Jerusalem, which is, by some estimates, 3 years later than this. So the gap between verses 25 and 26 could be as much as 3 or 4 years, depending on what timeline you adhere to. But it's just that fundamental point. Sins are easily forgiven, but consequences are not easily removed. But we will get to that a little bit next. Verse 22. But Saul increased all the more in strength and confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was Christ. Now, I would contend that this is possibly one of the more important verses in the text. What does it mean when it says Saul increased all the more in strength?
My version says Saul's preaching became more and more powerful.
Okay, there we go. Because in verse 19, in taking food he was strengthened, so you have a very direct reference to physical strengthening, but in verse 22, he increased in the power of his preaching. Why did he increase the power of his preaching?
Practice, for one thing.
Okay. Agreed.
Well, and it says they couldn't refute what he was saying. I mean, if you may go in the first time and go, oh, I'm not sure whether or not I'm going to be able to stand my own here. I mean, I'm trusting in you, God, but I'm really kind of nervous about this. But then the more you preach and the more you speak, and you can't say you're wrong about that, I mean, that gives you more confidence.
It is amazing to me the confidence that we gain by speaking truth and the amount of truth we speak when we have confidence. It's kind of hard to have one without the other, and that's a great point. And fundamentally, I was going to say the Spirit, the direction from the Spirit, but that's given because if he is speaking truth, he is speaking of the Spirit, or from the Spirit, or he's inspired by the Spirit. And so, it's just interesting to make that connection between confidence with what he speaks, or the strength of his preaching, and how it is related to the truth of his preaching. Because again, he just flipped. He just went from putting people in prison who believed this to now trying to convince all of the people that were supporting his former actions to start believing what he believes, which is just very, very interesting. What does your word say? And so after that it says, and confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus. What does it say for confounded? Baffled. How? Why? Why did he baffle them?
Just changing stance, I guess. I would think.
It's not what they expected. It is interesting, I guess, from the perspective of 2,000 years later. Let's try to make an apples to apples comparison. Let's just say at this point, when Paul really confuses them, Paul is speaking or preaching or declaring Jesus with the same intensity that he was persecuting Christians. So it's interesting that that something happens that, okay, how do we know which one's true? How do we know which one's true? And if he can speak the truth, which he is, if he can speak the truth, how would it be confusing to other people? How could it be baffling to other people that he's changed his message when he learns the truth?
Well, for one thing, when he was using violence beforehand. to try and get his point across to say, this is the way it has to be, and I'm gonna beat you up if you don't agree with me. And he's not doing that here. He's just letting the truth speak for itself. And I mean, just that would confuse people and scare people, I think. I mean, just, okay, wait a minute. Plus you still have all these other people that are continuing to beat you up if you decide you're gonna go with Paul. I mean, it says several times they're trying to kill him.
That makes sense, as it said, isn't this the same guy who made havoc?
Yeah.
What is this, what is he doing now?
Yeah,
He's not, makes no sense.
Yeah. he's not gonna beat me up to convince me to go the other way.
He's finding facts and proving more or less that he was giving them information refuting it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you use the critical word there, the word proof. He's proving Jesus to them. I thought that when you said that, it made me think of like, how do you make a middle school bully really angry? I don't know if you all know this because I've been bullied in middle school, but how do you make them really angry? You outsmart them.
Do what?
You just outsmart them. You're just wittier than them. Because that's what I found to be the case. Just like if you're witty to a bully or to somebody who uses brute force, it just tends to make you more angry, right?
I may have missed the whole point, but Paul's diligence in persecuting Christians, if I'm using the right word, with his diligence, now this is to me, his person, if he left that with as much diligence in something else after meeting Jesus, I'm the kind that say, I gotta listen to this guy because he was so sincere in what he did. And I'm thinking of coaches, you know, I'm going way back to coaching clinics and all this. And when they would say something, great names, coaches that y'all know, when they say they've changed their philosophy, I thought, I better listen because those guys be what, you see what I'm saying? To me, he had credibility from being so strong in what he did before. You're strong in what you do now, and you change something, I still listen to you because I'm like, she has a reason. She's not flaky. She has a reason for maybe enforcing it.
I think that's a good point. I do think it is, from my perspective, take that for whatever it's worth. I think what's the most confounding is not necessarily that the message changed in and of itself, as much as it's the way the message was conveyed. It went from imprisonment, follow this belief or your life is over or ruined, to here's the logical conclusion based on what you believe. You believe that the prophets have prophesied a coming Messiah. You believe that. And so here's the logical conclusion. There's a woman, there was a virgin in Bethlehem who gave birth. How do you know that's not the Messiah? Talk about Micah. You knew it was coming. It was here. You know, so it shifted from brute force. And to me, I think that is more confounding than necessarily just the change in the ideology alone. But that's, like I said, for whatever it's worth, that's kind of. And then Stephanie pointed out, used the word, and then the last part of the verse, lived in the masses by proving that Jesus was the Christ. This is completely vague, is it not? How did he prove that Jesus was the Christ?
Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians.
So he had written, but he
Yeah,
had written.
but that had to have been what he was saying too, that he was using the prophets, he was using, I mean, I think we see a lot of the proofs that he was using in the letters that he wrote later. I think that's the only thing we have to go on.
I don't disagree. I don't disagree at all. as this applies to us in proving Jesus, I think is the best word to use. In proving Jesus, for us now, it means being a living sacrifice and demonstrating and living out and exuding, demonstrating the fruits of the Spirit and what it actually looks like and how fulfilling and how rewarding it is to live in Jesus. Again, I don't disagree with what you're saying, but he's also talking to people who have a Jewish background. And so there are logical components to that where you get to make those arguments. But if you're dealing with somebody who does not have a shared belief or a shared faith, who may not even have a shared logic, it's kind of hard to reason with them if like you just don't have the basic fundamental tenets of belief or even rationale. Some people are very proof positive. Those people are annoying, as all others. Those would be like your scientists who can't prove anything yet demand proof from you. So I don't like scientists. I get it. I know it's ironic. But it's how do you prove Jesus to people who just fundamentally think differently? And so that's kind of the indirect application that I kind of want us to think about is, all right, what does that look like for us? For me, it does, it is a little bit weird for me because I do understand like the balance between compassion and thought in terms of like, no one cares what I think unless they know how much I care. And I have a hard time showing how much I care because I'm just not naturally that way. And so that's what I have to work on. So it's like, in order for me to prove Jesus, I have to actually really focus and work on being compassionate and being nice. I mean, for lack of better words, maybe sympathetic, empathetic. But it's like, what does it mean to prove Jesus? And I think it is absolutely different for every single person in here and in general. That's kind of funny. Or you could just read all the epistles. Which again, has the same influence. Any thoughts on like all that first part? Because we just spent probably more time on that one than I should have. When many days had passed, the Jews plotted to kill him, but their plot became known to Saul. They were watching the gates day and night in order to kill him. But his disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. Whose disciples?
Mine says some of the other believers.
Yeah, that's reference to Jesus' disciples. Jesus. Yeah. And again, timeline is important because, as Joe points out, the gospel has not gone to the Gentiles yet. So the only believers would have a background in Judaism, or they'd be descendants of one of the tribes of Israel, right? And so, where would they have spent most of their time? Hanging around the synagogue. I mean, even as Christians. And I do think this is an important point. I don't know if I've made it here before. I don't necessarily think that any of the first century Christians converted to Christianity. I don't think many of the first century Christians saw themselves as converting to Christianity.
So natural extension.
It's just a natural extension. I mean, Jesus fulfilled the law, and to follow Jesus is to follow the fulfillment of the law. Now, was belief in Jesus distinct and separate from what the children of Israel, the Jews, believed? Yes, absolutely 100%. Why? Because they did not see Jesus as Messiah. But there was a natural conclusion or a natural logical step to believe in Jesus, depending on how you interpreted the law. And so you have these first century Christians who believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, but that was not a stretch, that was not inherently different from what they were brought up in as Jewish believers. Why? Because Jesus was the fulfillment of the law that they believed. So that would naturally mean that they're spending more time around, they're still spending time around the synagogue. I mean, they're still spending time around all these people with whom they share customs, and so it's kind of interesting because like now, 2,000 years later, we know that Judaism and Christianity are very different. They have different customs. Crying out loud, Christians and Christians have different customs. So it makes sense that there are still first century Christians who are still around the synagogue. Let's see. All right, verse 26. And when he had come to Jerusalem, he attempted to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, and they did not believe that he was a disciple. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles and declared to them how on the road he had seen the Lord. He spoke to them and how at Damascus he had preached boldly the name of Jesus. Now, this is where we have the introduction of Barnabas. So let's go back to Acts chapter 4 momentarily.
Paparazzi made it.
There were not any person among them, for as many as were owners of the land or houses sold them and brought the proceeds that were sold and laid them at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as they had any need. Thus, Joseph, who was also called by the apostle Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, a Levite and native of Cyprus, sold a field that belonged to them and brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet. So we learn two things immediately about Barnabas. What are they? Well, three things. One, his name's not Barnabas.
But he was so encouraging that he got
He was so encouraging, he got the name of Barnabas. Okay? He's an encouraging guy. He's an encouraging fellow. Uplifting. Makes you feel good. All right, that's one.
He was from the tribe of Levi.
Okay, I guess we learned 5 or 6 things about him. Okay. There's 3 and 4.
Yeah, he was selfless.
He sold the field and gave it to who?
The apostles.
What were their function? Can I summarize it as church leadership? So here we have a very encouraging person who also subjects himself to the leadership, to the authority of the church. He follows in their directive, or submits his wealth and stuff to them. Okay. Just conceptually, I don't necessarily think of anybody just offhand that has sold a field and given it to church leadership here. Not to say it hasn't happened, I don't know. That's probably a good thing. But if you were to know somebody that basically took a large sum of money, their property, sold it just to give it to the eldership, and was also incredibly encouraging, you would think highly of that person, right? I mean, just, you would think highly of that person. So Barnabas' word probably carries more weight than most. I think that's a reasonable conclusion. I don't feel like I'm making a stretch here. When Barnabas comes in here to the Christians in Jerusalem, Barnabas comes in and says, "I stand up for him." They're going to listen, right? I mean, so it's amazing. There are at least 2 instances in which Barnabas chose to be possibly the most important person in the life of Paul. This is one. Because without Barnabas, it is possible that Paul did not get to Jerusalem. And the only reason why Barnabas can be Barnabas is because he has a reputation as an encourager, and he has a reputation of submitting himself to the authority of the church leadership, and he actually makes sacrifices of himself that are not insignificant. I should just say that are insignificant, that are significant. I like the one thing. I gotta stop that. Okay? And so, you know, it's one of those things where I don't think that the spreading of the gospel to the Gentiles would have been inhibited if Barnabas was not there. But Barnabas made it a lot easier. Any thoughts, comments on Barnabas or Paul at this point? So the church, so the church throughout all Judea and Galilee and Samaria had peace as was being built up, and walking in the fear of the Lord and the comfort of the Holy Spirit, it multiplied. So Paul leaves Jerusalem again, but this time is to save his life, because the Hellenists were ready to kill him. But after Paul leaves, because the Hellenists are trying to kill him, there's peace. I think it's only because of Barnabas. I'd make that conclusion. Because at this point, Jewish leaders have just really, the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem have just learned that their best guy is not on their side anymore. And maybe they had learned this beforehand, but there's no indication. And so it's possible that Barnabas helped bring peace to Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria. Possible. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
My version says, and with the encouragement of the Holy Spirit, and also through the numbers.
Yes.
So I agree that Barnabas was instrumental. It was through
Yeah, I
the
mean,
Holy Spirit.
there's not an aspect of Paul's life in which the Spirit is not the center. Touche. That's a great point. Good point. I'm using the ESV, so
It's one of the instances, one of the few instances where Paul got out of the way. You know, he isn't very much in your face kind of guy. But here, went on to Caesarea, back to Tarsus, whatever, and things progressed, things got better. Barnabas,
it's funny you say that. I mean, the reason why Paul ends up getting executed is because he did not get out of the way. Paul would have been let go. He would have been let go, I think, what was it? I can't even remember the place now. But he would have been let go early, but he said, I'm Roman. I'm going to make my appeal to Caesar. Right. It's like, as soon as he did that, guaranteed to seal his death, I mean, essentially. Which, I don't feel bad for Paul. I don't think Paul felt bad for Paul either. But it was just one of those things where, yeah, that's a good point. You know, he's in very intense, very type A type person. But he stepped back. He got out of the way here. It's a good point. Any final thoughts? All right.